The night I walked out of my own house, with both my children, I was still wearing the apron I'd forgotten to take off. It was a Tuesday in late November, and the snow that had been threatening all week had finally arrived the way it always does in Guelph. Quietly, almost apologetically, settling over everything without making a fuss. I drove my daughter Tessa and my son Wesley down the 401 toward Annette's place on the other side of the city, and I remember thinking, watching the snow blur past the windshield, that it made the suburbs look peaceful in a way that felt like a deliberate lie. I had left behind a full dinner table, a half-carved roast, and a woman still standing with her hand raised as though she hadn't quite decided whether she was proud of herself or merely surprised. 2 years later, that same woman's event rental company would be shuttered. Her name would be quietly removed from every vendor list she'd spent a decade cultivating. Her brother, my ex-husband, would be making structured monthly payments under a civil court order he'd agreed to, rather than face a fraud investigation that would have pulled his mother in right alongside him. I didn't plan any of it, I only planned dinner. My name is Lenora Ashby, and I have spent the better part of my adult life being very good at keeping careful records. I ran a small bookkeeping and financial consulting practice on Wyndham Street in Guelph for 18 years. I understood how numbers worked, how accounts balanced, how small discrepancies compounded into serious problems when they went unnoticed long enough. I understood all of this in a professional context. It took me far longer than it should have to apply the same logic to my own marriage. I met Conrad Harcastle at a mutual friend's cottage on Lake Huron the summer I was 28. He was easy to be with in the way certain people are. Not charming exactly, but warm, unhurried, the kind of man who actually listened when you spoke, rather than just waiting for his turn. He worked as a site supervisor for a construction company out of Kitchener, and drove a second-hand truck with more kilometers on it than good sense. On our third date, he arrived at my door holding a single flower stem that still had a rubber band from a newspaper wrapped around it, which told me it had been cut from someone's garden on the way over. I found it so completely disarming that I fell a little in love with him on the spot. We married 3 years later in a backyard ceremony at my parents' house just outside Elora. Conrad's family drove in from Ancaster with a particular kind of watchfulness I mistook, at the time, for reserve. His mother, Phyllis, was a small, neat woman who ran her household the way some people run a boardroom. Every detail managed, every arrangement a signal about who held authority and who was still earning it. His sister Rowena was 11 years his senior, divorced, and operated an event rental company that had been, by most accounts, on the verge of genuine success for as long as anyone in the family could remember. I was not what Phyllis had imagined for her son. Not because of anything she ever said plainly. She was far too deliberate for that. It was in the pause before she answered questions I asked, as though she were deciding what access I'd earned. I had my own income, my own professional standing. I didn't need her family to keep the hydro on. And I think that specific kind of independence struck Phyllis less as a quality and more as a complication. The small moments began early and accumulated slowly, the way water damage does, invisible until the wall finally gives. The first Christmas, Phyllis tasted my shortbread and said they were very even, in a tone that made it clear she considered consistency a poor substitute for actual flavor. At Tessa's first birthday party, Rowena mentioned casually to the table that it was interesting how some parents threw parties that felt more like performances for other adults than genuine celebrations for a child. At a retirement dinner for one of Conrad's colleagues, Phyllis leaned close to me near the food table and said softly that it was sweet how I always dressed like I was still in the office. And didn't I ever let myself just relax? Conrad was always elsewhere when these things happened. Not physically. He was often standing directly beside me. But his attention would shift the moment his mother or sister turned toward me. His eyes finding the middle distance. His hands suddenly needing to locate his drink or his jacket pocket. I told myself for years it was conflict avoidance. A lot of people are built that way. Over time I understood it was something more considered. A practiced refusal to spend any of his own comfort protecting mine. I absorbed it because I believed a marriage was something you protected, even when it had stopped protecting you. I absorbed it because Tessa adored her grandmother. And Wesley had grown up believing Sunday dinners at Phyllis's house in Ancaster were simply how family was supposed to feel. I absorbed it because every time I reached the edge of something, Conrad would do something genuinely kind. Leave tea on my desk without being asked, reach for my hand on a long drive, say something that made me laugh. Hard enough I forgot for a few days what I'd been carrying. 22 years. A marriage held together by love, and by the quieter, steadier habit of keeping the peace at any cost. I had carried the mortgage alone for 11 of those years. Conrad's work was steady but project-based, with gaps between contracts that could stretch through an entire season. My bookkeeping practice had grown from a one-room office with 2 clients into a firm that employed 4 people and served more than 60 small businesses across Wellington County. I never mentioned the income gap. I never made him feel the weight of it. The money I earned went into our household account, our children's RESP funds, and the RRSPs Conrad's father had drilled into him as the most serious obligation any sensible Canadian owed themselves. Because my client work kept me traveling and long hours kept me at the office, Conrad had gradually taken over the day-to-day management of our household banking, sometime around year 9. It felt like partnership. I signed what needed signing and trusted that the rest was handled. I did not yet understand how precisely that trust had been used against me. The dinner that ended everything was on an ordinary Tuesday in late November. It was not an anniversary or a birthday. It was simply a monthly family dinner. The kind I had been hosting for 2 decades because Phyllis expected them. And I had long since spending the energy to argue about expectations. I made a proper meal. Tourtière from my mother's handwritten recipe card. Butter chicken because Wesley had asked for it 3 times that month. And a sugar pie I'd started the evening before, and that had set exactly right overnight. Phyllis arrived first, and moved through my kitchen. With that particular quality of attention she'd always carried. Fingertips brushing the counter. Eyes moving over everything, with the calm precision of someone conducting an audit. Rowena arrived 20 minutes late, as she always did, and settled into the chair at the end of the table nearest the window. The seat I always kept open for guests because the light was good there, and made herself comfortable as though it had been assigned to her by deed. When the food was ready, I served Tessa and Wesley first, moving efficiently so nothing would go cold. Then Phyllis. Then I picked up the serving spoon to fill my own plate. I had been on my feet for 4 hours. I hadn't eaten since noon. Rowena's hand came across the table and closed around my wrist. You serve your guests before you serve yourself. Her voice was pleasant, conversational. The careful voice of a woman who knows she has an audience. Didn't your mother teach you anything? I looked at Conrad. He looked at the tablecloth. 22 years, 4 hours of cooking, 11 years of mortgage payments, 1 serving spoon. I set the spoon down. I set it down very deliberately, the way you set something down when your hands need a moment to stay steady while the rest of you makes a decision that has been a long time coming. Then I looked at Rowena and said quietly, without raising my voice, my mother taught me a great many things. She taught me that a guest in someone else's home doesn't reach across the table. She taught me that a woman who needs to make herself larger by making others smaller has never actually been very large. And she taught me that a husband who won't stand up for his wife at her own table has given up his right to remain at it. Rowena stood up and hit me across the face. The sound was sharp enough that Wesley pushed back his chair. Tessa's hand went to her mouth. Phyllis sat with the precise stillness of a woman who had been waiting a long time for exactly this. I stood up, I looked at Rowena, and I slapped her back, once with 22 years of very patient silence behind it. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms do when something irreversible has just happened. I did not apologize, I did not explain myself. I looked at Conrad, not at Rowena, not at Phyllis, at Conrad, and I said I am done. Then I asked Tessa and Wesley to get their coats. Conrad said my name once, I didn't stop. I drove to Annette's house. My oldest friend, who had watched me absorb 2 decades of Hardcastle hospitality, with the long-suffering patience of someone who had bitten her tongue. So many times it had become a reflex. She opened her door before I knocked, took one look at all three of us standing on her steps in the dark, and said simply, "Come in. I'll put the kettle on." She made up the spare room without asking how long we needed it. Conrad called that night, then again in the morning, then at intervals throughout the following days, until my phone became something I carried like a small, unpleasant obligation. When I finally answered, 4 days later, sitting in Annette's kitchen with both hands around a mug, he offered the kind of apology that is really just an inventory of everything suddenly at risk. He should have said something, he knew that now. He was sorry. Rowena was sorry. His mother just wanted things to return to normal. "Please come home. The kids need their father." I asked him one question. "How many times, Conrad? How many times over 22 years did you watch your mother or your sister say something at that table they meant to cut me down, and you looked at the floor?" He had no answer. We both knew what the number was. I had stopped counting somewhere around year 7, because a number that large felt less like evidence and more like a verdict I wasn't ready to say out loud. I filed for divorce 20 days after the dinner. I found a lawyer named Arthur Deakins through my accountant. A measured, methodical man who had spent 30 years in Ontario family law and had the particular quality of never seeming surprised by anything. I told him what I wanted: the house primary residence for Tessa and Wesley, and a clear accounting of where our finances had actually been going. That last part, as it turned out, mattered considerably more than I had known. Arthur requested full financial disclosure, as he always did. What the documents revealed took me 3 separate readings to fully absorb. Over the previous 4 years, $78,000 had been drawn against the home equity line of credit attached to our house. A line I had arranged years earlier and largely left alone because it had never been touched while I was handling our accounts. The withdrawals had been structured in amounts that stayed just below the threshold that would have flagged automatic notifications to me. Every dollar had gone to Rowena's event rental company, recorded as loans that were never repaid and, from the paperwork, never genuinely intended to be. Conrad had signed off on every withdrawal. On 2 of the documents, my name appeared as a co-borrower. Arthur sent those 2 to a forensic examiner, who confirmed within 3 weeks that the signatures were not mine. Arthur was careful to keep me steady. "These processes take time," he said. "The land registry would need to be involved. A financial crimes detective would need to speak with the notary. Banks would need to respond to formal requests. None of it would move at the pace I wanted." He was right on every count. There was one more finding, and I remember sitting in his office on King Street when he told me, the low winter light coming flat through the window behind him, and I went very still in my chair. Buried in the land records was a notarized document drafted 18 months before the dinner. Before any of this, before the apologies, before everything, that purported to transfer a 15% ownership interest in our Guelph home into Phyllis's name. The document carried my signature. The Ontario Land Registry had flagged it during their standard verification process, because the signature presented didn't match the one on file from our original mortgage registration. The transfer had never been completed, but the attempt had been made, witnessed, and signed by a notary whose paperwork Arthur would spend the following months carefully tracing. I sat in my car in the parking structure beside Arthur's building for 20 minutes before I could bring myself to drive. For 22 years, I had told myself the worst of it was the words. The small comments, the table politics, the 1,000 quiet arrangements designed to make me feel like a guest in my own life. The words had been covering for something with a great deal more at stake than my feelings at any particular dinner table. Wesley was 17 when we left and 19, by the time the settlement was finalized. He processed it the way he processed most things he didn't have language for, quietly, through his hands. And emerged from Annette's garage 3 months after the dinner, with a lopsided but perfectly functional bookshelf that he presented to me with a solemnity that made my chest ache. He asked me once, not long after we left the house, whether it was his fault for not saying something that night. I held his face in both hands the way I had when he was small and told him clearly, nothing at that table was yours to fix. That was between the adults, and the adults had not been behaving like adults for a very long time. Tessa, at 24, understood more than she let on. She had a quiet, precise anger about it that she mostly kept to herself. Though I learned months later, she had sent Rowena a single text message that read, "You hit my mother in her own home and I will not be forgetting that." I didn't tell her off for it. The civil proceedings advanced on the strength of the documented paper trail. Conrad, confronted with a fraud referral that would have drawn Phyllis and Rowena into a criminal investigation alongside him, agreed to a structured settlement that included full repayment of the $78,000 drawn against the home equity line, each in monthly installments over 3 years. The forged signatures on the HELOC documents were referred to the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit. Arthur told me plainly that matters like this could sit in a queue for 1 to 3 years before seeing any courtroom, and that most resolved without a trial. Once the civil record was strong enough that no one wanted to test it in front of a judge. He was honest about it. I appreciated that more than I could properly articulate. The land transfer document, the one designed to give Phyllis 15% of my house, was formally voided by the Ontario Land Registry. The property was confirmed as mine in the divorce settlement. Clear title, in my name alone. Arthur found, while cross-referencing property records as a matter of professional habit, that Phyllis had made a nearly identical attempt once before. Decades earlier, against her late husband's sister, in a property dispute that had settled quietly outside of any public record. This was not a desperate impulse. It was the deliberate action of a woman who had done it before, and believed that careful people, patient people, people who still loved their husbands and wanted to keep things civil, would absorb it in silence. She had been right about that for a long time. Rowena's event rental company folded within 8 months of Conrad cutting off the money that had never truly been his to give. Several of her long-standing clients, it emerged, had harbored quiet doubts for years about invoices that didn't quite reconcile with what had actually been delivered. Once her reputation began to fray publicly, those doubts surfaced quickly. She shut the company before the end of the next fiscal year and moved back into Phyllis's house in Ancaster. I heard about it through Conrad's younger cousin Fletcher, a soft-spoken man who had always been kind to me at family gatherings, and who sent me a message once the divorce was finalized to say he was sorry he hadn't spoken up sooner. I thanked him genuinely. I didn't tell him that his long kindness and his long silence had always been the same thing, arriving in different clothes. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in March. I walked out of the courthouse on Woolwich Street into early spring air that still had winter left in it, which felt about right for the occasion. Arthur shook my hand in the lobby and told me I had been a remarkably clear-headed client. I told him he had been worth every dollar of his retainer, which he had been, without question. Conrad asked to meet once before the papers were signed. We sat in a coffee shop on Stone Road. Neutral ground. The way these things need to be when trust has been entirely spent. And he told me he was sorry for all of it. That he knew he had never been the husband he should have been. That he hoped in time, I might find a way to forgive him. He looked older than when I'd last seen him. The kind of older that has nothing to do with years. I believed he meant it. I also understood that an apology offered only after the settlement documents are ready is not accountability. It is damage control, arriving years too late to mean what it might once have meant. I had spent 22 years forgiving smaller versions of that same silence, each time telling myself the next slight would be the one that finally changed something. I was 52 years old. I was finished extending credit. I had not consciously decided to offer. I told him I appreciated the apology. I wished him genuinely well. I told him I hoped he found a way to be the father Tessa and Wesley needed him to be, because that was the only thing that still mattered to me where he was concerned. Then I finished my coffee and left. My bookkeeping practice grew faster in the year and a half after the divorce finalized than it had in any comparable stretch before. Annette and I brought on a junior partner, a sharp young woman named Bridget, recommended by a long-standing client, who was exactly what the firm needed to handle the contracts we'd started taking on. Clients began to remark, gently and with some puzzlement, that my work had a different quality to it, more decisive, one of them said, less hedged. I didn't have a clever answer for them. I only knew that a woman who is no longer quietly spending half her interior resources managing someone else's family politics has a great deal more of herself available for everything else. Wesley asked me last autumn, while we were making dinner in my kitchen, why his grandmother hadn't been to the house in so long. I thought about it for a moment, the real version of the thought, not the careful one. I told him, some people stay close only as long as they can find something to take from the closeness. When there's nothing left to take, they tend to find somewhere else to be. He nodded and went back to chopping the carrots. He has always been a practical person, my son. He learned it early and he has never lost it. Tessa asked me, in a different conversation, whether I hated Rowena. I told her no, and I meant it. Hatred requires ongoing attention, and I had decided that Rowena had earned none of mine. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name, a clear-eyed accounting of what those years had actually cost. And a private reckoning with how long I had chosen not to add it up. I think about that dinner sometimes, but not the moment it broke open. I think about the 22 years before it. All the times I looked at Conrad and waited for him to choose differently, and the strange, spacious quiet that arrived in me once I stopped waiting. The last thing I noticed, walking to my car that night with Tessa and Wesley behind me, was that the snow had fallen harder while we were inside. The driveway was white and undisturbed. My footprints going to the car were the only ones in it. Annette made chili that Sunday. Her mother's recipe, kidney beans, a full day of simmering behind it. She put the pot in the center of the table without ceremony. I picked up the ladle without thinking and served my own bowl first. Tessa helped herself next. Wesley reached across for the bread. Nobody said a word about the order of it, because there was nothing to say. Some tables are built exactly like that. Every person sitting at them is genuinely glad you came. I've been eating at mine ever since.